Welcome back to Giving Tuesday live at the Boyce Thompson Institute. Thank you for joining us for this day of a look at our researchers and some of our alumni and our tech transfer department. We've really covered quite the gamut of BTI, and now we are joined by the person who's kind of tasked with being in charge of it all and setting our strategy and our vision. It's President David Stern. Dave, thanks for coming on again. Second year in a row.
I'm a regular, Keith.
David just returned from California last night, so he was very kind to come in here and fight the jet lag and tell us all about some of the great stuff BTI is doing, and especially in this past year alone. So one thing I don't know if everyone knows about David is he has a farm of his own. So tell us a little bit about your farm at your house and your work with the farmers market and everything like that.
Sure. This is my wife's baby. You think you know everything about someone and been married to them for a while, and then you find out otherwise. And my wife had always had a little dream of having a farm, and we ended up with one after she graduated from veterinary school. They talked us into it. If you visit a farm in New York in the middle of August, the sun's shining, the hills are green, it all looks great. And we started off like everybody does with some chickens, and then we went to the cows and the sheep and the ducks and the guinea hens and the dogs and the cats, and I can't remember what else. And we have a small farm. We do a lot of work with the sheep. Particularly my wife's passion is the fiber. She does a lot of work with the fiber. We go to festivals, and she has a whole secret world there that I just see little bits and pieces of. She has admirers, and it's just wonderful to see what she can do with her hands, and just so proud of her. And because we have all this land, I get to scratch my horticultural itch. I've been a gardener since I was a little kid, my mom, and all of a sudden there was 200 acres to garden. So that's been fun to fall in love with farm machinery and making your own hay, and then raising a few crops here and there, some specialty crops, particularly in the vegetables and small fruits, and we had to do something with them. And most people who get into hobby farming don't think about marketing and what you're going to do with everything you raise, and that's how I got involved with the farmers market. And that farmers market's a worldwide known farmers market. What's real special about it is that everyone who sells there has to produce their own goods, so no reselling is allowed, and everything has to come within 30 miles of Ithaca, of the market down at Steamboat Landing, and that makes it special. And so we started vending there 7 years ago, and all of a sudden, turn around, you've been there 7 years, and now I'm the president of the board of the farmers market. Maybe.
Wow, all right. Another president title. You never have too many of those.
I think you can have a lot. Way too many.
Sounds like a lot.
As soon as the number gets above zero, you got to start questioning your sanity. But they do look for people. The farmers market is, they're wonderful people. They're very creative, the cooks, the artisans, the producers, but they're not business people in the sense of running a large cooperative type of business. It's farmers market's a corporation. It's a for-profit corporation. And so I've tried to help them with the planning things, the kind of things I've learned at BTI. And they also need to plan for the future, just like this organization, Boyce Thompson, does. And so it's been a very interesting interdigitation of two very different activities, but BTI often talks about the future of food and local food production and new crops, and that's what's being sold at the farmers market. So mostly by accident, I've become involved in two ends of what you think of BTI doing, discoveries on the one hand, and maybe something more specific and tangible for society on the other end. And I happen to be involved in both. It's just been it's what happens when you don't bother to plan your life. You can be opportunistic, you know.
Well, we just talked with an alumnus who kind of has had a similar career path. We're just kind of being flexible and adaptable and seeing where you end up in the science world.
We need to redefine our what a path really is, what the word even means.
Right, yeah.
Traditionally, we always think of pipelines, and you get it onto the conveyor belt one end, and you come out the other end, and you're something. But most people aren't very good planners because life is too uncertain. That's the beauty of it, but also the craziness of it. So if we try to over-plan, we usually end up unprepared for what's really going to happen. And I think maybe being a bad planner in some respects, like when people say, what do you want to be when you grow up? I've never really been able to answer that question. And so now I'm grown up, and then some.
So considering that, briefly take us take us on the journey from how you went from a little kid who was really obsessed with gardening to now the president of a plant and life science research institute. How do you get from that to where we are now?
Well, I think there's two kinds of scientists out there. There's people like me who were born with an advantage. My dad was a scientist, and we call these sorts of people legacies, and you'll see an awful lot of people in science who've been around it since they were kids. And obviously I had some admiration for what my father was doing. Both my sister and I used to go to his lab when we were waiting for him to get ready to go home, and she got into illustration a little bit when she looked through the microscope. I was more interested in maybe the microscope itself. And then my dad became a department chair and got involved in some of the upper levels of administration of this University of California. And he was a very ethical person, and he was respected for that, how he managed people, how he thought about the whole and not about the parts. I was exposed to all of that. And then when I went to college, I was a pre-med, but that didn't really suit me very well. I volunteered in a hospital, and I didn't like what I was being asked to do. And then I discovered research, just a lot of people do, through a course taught by a scientist who was excited about how discoveries got made, like to tell the stories. And then, you see yourself in one of those stories. And all of a sudden, I was off to working as an undergraduate in the lab. And as I say, I had all the advantages. My dad was a faculty member. A lot of the family friends were university. So I was able to get through doors quite easily. People knew where they were. Of course, you have to bring your own motivation, your own brain to all that. You have to bring something to it. But it was relatively easy for me to get involved. And so I just did science because it was what I liked to do. I was a researcher. You come into work and you never know what you're going to find. And I had a lot of freedom. I was really lucky where I went to school and what I was allowed to do. And then I got the opportunity to join BTI. It was the last interview I believe I did out of a lot of interviews, job interviews in those days. And I was just amazed that there was this place where you could come in and there was no real teaching. It was really just a research institute that was focused on plants. And what I did was a plant research. What? Any further questions? I did move from the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. I was a postdoc at Berkeley and a grad student at Stanford, and it was a very much of a culture shock for me. People did call Ithaca the Berkeley of the East, but that analogy didn't go very far in those days. You couldn't get a good cup of coffee, at least the kind I thought was good. Nobody knew what an avocado was, and I had grown up around them. Yeah. So it's taken a lot of adjustment. But I think, again, my path to the presidency was one of happenstance. There was a need, and I was interested. I was becoming more interested in how the fabric of science is stitched together, not just in what I could do or what people in my lab could do on a day-to-day basis, but in fact, how did this all get here? Who makes the decisions about where the money's going to go? Where do the big ideas come from? And I knew nothing about any of that, but I'd start to see in action some of the people who did make those decisions at the National Science Foundation and other places. And I guess I became intrigued about that, how one could have perhaps a longer view and maybe a longer term effect, maybe a small effect, but one that was guided by a longer vision or a bigger vision, thinking at 10,000 feet or whatever you want to call it. And then I was able to bring that into practice in the presidency. So it's been an interesting journey, but certainly not an expected one.
Well, so you talked about pathways and how we define that, and I think that's a really great segue into kind of what's been happening at BTI this past year and maybe even a little beyond. And one of those areas is how we talk about postgraduate training. And you've done a lot of work with collaborators on kind of redefining what that looks like. Why was it important for you to kind of consider a new vision for that, and where do you think it's currently at right now? Are you happy with what everyone came up with? Are you ever happy, really? But do you feel pretty good about the progress you've made?
I think we've given a name to some of the issues that have been festering for a long time in academia. And what I mean by that is, as you start to move up and think about things at a higher level, you start to see, I call it the social system that's prevalent in academia. And faculty members have this certain status. It's a little bit exalted, but it's also powerful. So there's a huge power differential, if you will, between a faculty person and the folks that work in his or her laboratory group in most constructs. So in a traditional way of thinking about it, a faculty member would raise some money through grant proposals and so on, and then that work would be done by essentially apprentices, graduate students, postdocs, and so on, who would follow that faculty member's instructions. And so there's a power differential there. And so what happens is that the apprentices, if you will, are there to perpetuate the career of the faculty member, if we think about it in an extreme way. And so what is it that who's caring about the futures of the students, the postdocs? How is their future being managed and prepared for? So I think in some respects, when I was growing up as a faculty member, I went through laboratories and I felt I was privileged to be in those places and be able to do what I wanted to do, but I'm only passing through. When I left there, I left it all behind and I had to start all over again. And the tools I got along the way, the training I got along the way, was whatever happened to go along with the research, whatever was inherent in it. And so I think this is a dynamic that's not really healthy in academia, because it places trainees, if you will, the postdoc students and techs, at a disadvantage because their future aspirations are not being taken into account enough as they go through their research training. And so the group that the network that I run, the national network called the Plant Science Research Network, it's just a grouping of 16 professional scientific societies that's supported by an NSF grant. We wanted to take a look and see what trainees wanted. What could we do for trainees that would support discovery science, that would support applied science, but would also support the career development of the trainees themselves? And so now we get to thinking about, what does a trainee need? What tools do they need that might be useful in different career paths? If we get back to this idea that we don't really know what we're going to become, we need to be prepared to be flexible. What kind of tools? Communication tools, management tools, and so on. What kind of tools will help us in a lot of different paths? And as soon as we started writing our reports and thinking about what this was, we realized it wasn't one path. And we started to try to, this is the PSRN, to come up with the right metaphor for the kind of training we were thinking about. And we had all kinds of metaphors. We had mazes, we had labyrinths, we had everything but pipelines. But in the end, our report came up with a subway system. And a subway system is where, if you think about a map of a metro system, for example, we used the Washington, D.C. Metro because we happen to have a map of that handy. It was recolored and relabeled, but it's the Washington, D.C. Metro.
I feel like that one gets pretty good reviews.
The trains are a little old, but it goes where you need to go. I think that's the point of it.
Right.
And there's a lot of stations where you can change trains. So in that metaphor, you get on at a certain station. You may come, as I did, from privilege. You may not come from privilege, but there's always a place where you can get on. It might be midlife. It might be from the get-go in life. And then each of the stations represents a kind of training you might want to acquire. It could be experimental training. It could be an internship at a company. It could be a writing assignment. It could be something at the national academies where you're a researcher for that, do reports there, and so on. There are many different kinds of experiences, and the stations could represent those experiences. And at any point, you can get off the train and have a job. So maybe you work in journalism for a while, and you get back on at a station, get some more training, and go on to another job. So the idea is there's many paths, and they're all connected. And our training can help take us from one path to another. We can get on and off and so on. And that's a metaphor that I feel quite excited about and quite comfortable with. And of course, it's something that people already do. But they do it on their own initiative. They have to figure out what the paths look like, what the training opportunities are. They're not warehoused anywhere. They're not accessible. It's hard to get funding to do those trainings. So the idea of our report is that this sort of a very flexible system should be formalized and made available very broadly. And especially if it comes with funding, we'll bring in a much more diverse cohort of people, not just people from privilege or money who can afford to take chances and to move different places in life to get on and off the train, but in fact people who otherwise couldn't do that, and we want to make it available to them. And so we've been exhorting funders, funding agencies to think about different ways of allocating resources to trainees so trainees can choose how to get trained. And so they don't have to go where the money is exclusively and get trained in whatever way would happen by joining that group, that lab, that organization, if that makes any sense. So we call it trainee-centric training. Mm-hmm. It's customizable, it's modular, and it's directed towards a person's individual career aspirations. And of course, that's what we're trying to do at BTI. We're trying to do that through our education outreach department and through other resources we have here, through some of our donors really support it. And the idea is that BTI is a career stop. It's not just a place where you do some science and get out. It's a place where you build your skills. And the skills can be built for the high school interns, for the undergraduate interns, for our postdocs, our graduate students and technicians, and even in our research support staff. I don't care who it is, they should come out of BTI being a more complete and prepared person than they were coming in. If we don't do that, we're not doing all of our mission.
So that, that vision is, as you called it, kind of trainee-centric. It's a lot about the development of the individual, but I know you also spend a lot of time, or have in the past, looking at kind of the future vision of research in general. What does research look like in various budgetary scenarios or demand scenarios? I think we talked a little bit about that last year, but does this opportunity for the individual also support kind of the flexibility that's going to be needed in the future for the general industry?
That's a great question. So before the PSRN did any work on training, we did have to look at the future in a much bigger way. And so, again, these were just things I've been taught. I've been fortunate to be around them and to learn them as president. And so one of these was essentially strategic planning. But strategic planning, and the way I was first exposed to it, made certain assumptions for the future, let's say 3 years or 5 years out, and then one worked towards those assumptions. But what if the assumptions are wrong? And by the way, they almost always are. So I took a course at one point, a mini course on scenario planning, which says, the heck with it, the future is uncertain, let's embrace that. And so, again, I don't want to rehash what we did last year, but we allow ourselves to place plant science as a very broad discipline into 4 different futures that we might encounter in this country and around the world. And the differences in the futures were depending on things that literally are out of control of scientists, like public attitude towards science, the federal budget, climate change, things that we can't really control, but they do influence our ability to do business. And what came out of those scenarios, which are very different, and they're deliberately very different, is that there's some elements in them that are common, and some of those are what you mentioned with your last guest, for example, flexibility and adaptability. So in all of those scenarios, it's really important for scientists, for plant scientists and probably well beyond plant science, to be able to rapidly change their skill sets and what they do to take advantage of emerging opportunities. And so these kind of modular training is a derivative of that, because if we're going to be flexible and adaptable, we can't commit 5 years to learning something. 5 months, yes, 5 years, no. So they're really two sides of the same coin. It's just implementing training in view of an uncertain future.
And part of that kind of embracing a new path is a new initiative we're trying here with what we're calling a faculty cluster hire. Tell us a little bit about what that is, what that means, and what was kind of the impetus for going down this road.
One of the more interesting exercises we conducted in this visioning of training was we had 2 workshops, 1 year apart, and the first one was dominated, I'm talking about in numbers, by faculty and upper administration, and the second one was all trainees, all postdocs and students, technicians, undergraduates. And they came up with one of their ideas, which was really cool. They called it was a virtual laboratory. A virtual laboratory is not a laboratory that's not owned by, quote unquote, by one faculty member, but is owned by a bunch of them. And they share this project and they share this laboratory. I got to thinking about that. And then we went into strategic planning with BTI last year. This idea again of collaboration came up, how central collaboration is to good science. And how do you really get collaboration going? Is collaboration just who you run into in the hallway or by the coffee pot, or is collaboration something that you plan for and you design around? And we decided to design around collaboration. And rather than bringing in scientists one at a time, let's say you hire person A this year, person B 3 years from now, and hope that they collaborate down the road, we thought, what if we brought them all in at once? What if we brought them in as a team from day one around a collaborative idea? And earlier this year, we made a first foray into that. We called it team hires, and that didn't quite work out the way we wanted. We came back with an ad for cluster hires where, in the end of the day, we had a very large pool of talented scientists, extremely talented, very international, from 8 countries. We had over 100 applications. They were really interesting people. We brought in 8 women and 5 men, all in one day. And they had a symposium, and they presented short talks, and they mixed with each other, and we provided opportunities for them to vision collaborative projects on the second day. They loved this. And They didn't think they were going to love it. They thought, oh, I'm going to be brought face to face with my competitors. But they found out the real goal was to make them all collaborators. And a lot of that is how we set up the mechanics of the hiring exercise. So right now, we're waiting for proposals for proposed clusters to come back to us from these 13 scientists. I've seen two of them so far, but it's well before the deadline. So I expect...
So no pressure if you're watching.
No pressure if you're watching. We're really excited to see your ideas. And what we're planning to do in January is bring 1, 2, 3 potential clusters back to BTI, and let's talk about how you view your collaborative future. And our goal is to land 2 or 3 really exciting young scientists here at BTI and diversify our faculty, which is we're top heavy, and in a new way, in a really novel way that I think is very, very exciting. And it's exciting to the applicants too, because they don't feel they're going to be judged as icons of science, as people who need to be important individuals, but in fact as people who are collaborators from day one, people who love to work together with each other on bigger ideas than they could work on by themselves. And I'm just excited at how this is playing out so far, but I'm a little like a nervous father at the same time. You don't want it to fail.
Yeah.
But if it does, we'll try again. So.
Well, it's really interesting, to watch the kind of behind the scenes of research evolve, and what you're doing shows how you have to rethink what you're doing outside of the lab to ensure the best within the lab moving forward. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in, oh, what's happening in the lab? What's coming out of the lab? What new technologies, new discoveries are coming out of the lab? You might forget what you need to do outside the lab to support the sustainability of your operation. And so I think it's important that yourself and BTI and other collaborators are really thinking big picture about that.
That's the tug of war everybody has. Sometimes it's called the urgent versus the important. Sometimes it's called the big picture versus the immediate. Right. We all have to get up and have breakfast in the morning. We can't just be dreaming about our wedding day, That's just goes with the territory.
Yeah. Well, my last question is, so you've been at BTI a while, both as a scientist and in an administrative role. And I wanted to ask you this question because it is Giving Tuesday, and it's this National Day of Nonprofit Philanthropy. And science still is largely funded from, big government agencies for the most part. But you're starting to see more private philanthropy come in. Bill and Melinda Gates are kind of one famous example. How do you see the future of funding research? Do you think it's going to become increasingly important to have that private arm in addition to the public funding?
I'll answer that in 2 different ways. One is from a sustainability standpoint of the Institute. We need to pay our bills. We want to keep making discoveries. And from that point of view, funding diversification is what it's all about. That's true for probably all of our compatriot institutions. The federal money isn't there the way it used to be. The funding rates are low, the budgets are flat, and they've gone up a little bit recently, but not as fast as costs have. Right. So from a diversification point, a sustainability point, absolutely. I think a lot of those funds, but certainly not all of them, tend to be more directed towards particular problems, to particular issues, maybe a citrus greening today, or a pathogen tomorrow, that's another new emerging pathogen, or some other problem that's been identified, a genome that needs to be sequenced. And there are people at BTI who are very good at solving those problems, and they want to do that. But I think the blue sky discoveries are where it is all what it's all about in the end of the day. If we don't build that foundation of knowledge, we'll never get to be able to solve those problems. And that's what we learned from some of these scenarios that I referred to earlier. So the other way I'll answer your question is to say it's derelict of this country how little it invests in basic research. And the federal government ought to be funding it. I can't think of a better use for tax dollars than to support discoveries into nature, biology, all sorts of things that'll support our understanding of the planet and the things that are on it, and support its sustainable future. So I don't think that private donors and philanthropists should be substituting. I think they should be adding to a basic corpus of research that is funded by the government. It's simply a dereliction of duty, and if you look around the world, the amount of the GDP that the U.S. is investing into R&D is very low. We're the wealthiest country in the world. We ought to act like it where our scientific heritage and our scientific future is concerned. But I am really, really grateful for everyone who has contributed to BTI. You've helped us keep going. You've helped us move in new directions. And we are counting on that support. It's a fact. And I'm just thankful that, we have had such strong support from our friends.
Well, David, thank you very much for your time, and as David said, thank you very much for the individuals and organizations that have supported BTI Science, and you can continue to do that today as well. btiscience.org/give on this Giving Tuesday is where you can go to support all of the wonderful research and initiatives we've talked about throughout the day. We're going to let David out of the hot seat, but coming up next is our Emeritus faculty panel, which I'm really looking forward to, and you're going to want to stick around for that. We'll be back in just 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll talk a lot about history of research at BTI and kind of how it's paying dividends now.